Hello, and welcome to Sustainable Outlook, a podcast from global law firm K&L Gates, where we discuss the transactions, technologies, and trends in the sustainable economy. We hope you enjoy this discussion. Please reach out with suggested topics or guests, or questions about how we can work together to create a sustainable economy.
Welcome to this episode of Sustainable Outlook. For those who are new to this series, Sustainable Outlook explores sustainability as it relates to our world today and into the future. We talk with guests who are on the front lines of creating a sustainable economy, who share their perspective on sustainability, what it means, how it applies to their organization, how they identify and implement sustainability goals, and what they're doing at their organization to move us further toward a more sustainable economy. I'm Molly Barker, an attorney in the environmental and energy practice at K&L Gates. I am very excited to be joined today by a longtime friend, Julianne Stelmazik. Julie serves as the second director of food strategy for the State of Rhode Island, where she is responsible for the implementation of the state's food strategy, Relish Rhody. In her role, she works to accelerate the growth of a regional, equitable, and sustainable food economy by convening stakeholders, supporting business development in the food sector, and advising on effective state policies and regulations. Prior to this role, Julie spent a decade in the food and agriculture sector, working with schools, businesses, and institutions to address sustainability issues and increase local food procurement. Most recently, she served as the Regional and Sustainable Food Systems Manager for Boston College, where she implemented sustainability and procurement strategies in support of the New England Food Vision. She has worked in various parts of the food sector as a chef, farmer, and food educator. Julie holds a BA from Northeastern University, where we originally met, and an MBA from the Boston College Carroll School of Management. Thanks so much for joining us, Julie.
Thanks for having me, Molly.
So to start out, tell us first about what brought you to work for Rhode Island and specifically into your role there as Director of Food Strategy.
Sure. So I think, food systems is a really exciting space right now. We're starting to see it grow more and more. And I don't know that I would have said this 10 years ago, but looking back, I can really see how roles that I've been in the past, and this role is really in that kind of food system space. I really got interested in food and agriculture maybe a decade ago when I had the opportunity to work on a local vegetable farm in Massachusetts during the harvest season. And aside from just being so much fun to be outside in the sun and harvesting carrots and working with my hands, it really inspired me to think about where my food comes from and how that was connected to a broader system of people and land. And so I just had so many great opportunities to really keep working in the food system. Beyond that, I got interested in the kitchen, in thinking about food production from a food service and chef perspective. So I worked in professional kitchens for a while. And then I really moved into the institutional space in thinking about procurement, kind of that farm to institution space, which took me to Boston College. And when I was there, I really kind of got inspired by the power of these everyday meals and how we're feeding such a large population. So at Boston College, we served 20,000 meals a day. So it was an enormous amount of food that we were buying every day. And in part, it was driven by what the students wanted to eat, but it was also just driven by procurement policy. And so I really had an opportunity there to get into the operations and work with the procurement team and the director of dining and the chefs to really think about how to move, kind of nudge students towards a more plant-based diet, more sustainable diets, and also thinking about packaging and procurement and distribution. And so that was a grant-funded position for a few years. And it just so happened that the director of food strategy position had been vacant. It was during the pandemic. And it was really just the perfect moment for me to take this experience that I've had over the years in both food production and food service, and kind of move it into the policy space.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So what do you do in your role then as Director of Food Strategy? And maybe you can talk a little bit about the history of Rhode Island's Strategic Food Program and what its mission is overall.
I ask that question. I get asked that question quite a lot. People are saying, what is the director of food strategy? It's a somewhat of a new role. Rhode Island's actually just a handful of states that has a position like this. We're starting to see these types of roles pop up in municipalities and at some other kind of state levels. Rhode Island launched our state food strategy in 2016 under our former governor. It's called Relish Rhody, and it really focused on an opportunity that we had to grow a more regional and sustainable food system in our state under these kind of three frameworks: economic development, environmental resiliency, and health equity. So taking that food systems approach to say, yes, our food economy is large. There's so many opportunities for us to create more jobs and grow more of our own food. But can we also take that as an opportunity to address food access and inequity and think about more sustainable production methods and food consumption? So it really was a roadmap, I guess, that was launched. And part of that involved hiring a position to oversee the implementation and really the development of that plan. So my predecessor led that process with, hundreds of stakeholders and partners across the state. And in fact, I think we're only one of maybe 18 states that has a state sanctioned food plan. We certainly were not the first. So we're lucky to kind of have other states that we can look to, like Michigan and Vermont, and even New Mexico, that have been doing this for a decade or so.
Interesting. Well, I'll definitely want to ask more about that in a moment. But for now, I do want to know what you see to be Relish Rhody's biggest challenge in the transition to more of a sustainable food economy for Rhode Island.
Yeah, I guess I think about this a lot. One of our goals that's part of our state food strategy is part of a more regional effort. It's called the New England Food Vision. You mentioned that earlier. And it came out in 2014 from the University of New Hampshire, really calling for 50% of our food that we consume in New England to be produced here by 2060. And the reason for that is because while we have a really high population of food consumers, it was estimated that just about 10 or 12% is produced here in the New England region in the 6 states. So we're importing the huge majority of our food from outside the region. We're also exporting some food as well. And that just has to do with diet. So in Rhode Island, for instance, over 80% of the fish that lands on our shores in the ocean state is actually exported overseas. So we do produce food, but we're not necessarily eating it. And so I think that there's a couple challenges that exist. I think one is on the production side. Rhode Island, first of all, is not going to produce 50% of our food. We just don't have, we're the tiniest state. We just don't have that land. So we really think about it as in a regional way, which I think is really inspiring and has a lot of potential to succeed. But New England is, it's not the Midwest. We don't have thousands of acres of flat farmland. Mm-hmm. We have a lot of mountainous areas. We have dense urban areas. And so from a production standpoint, I think one of our challenges is just land and development and how we think about allocating land to growing and manufacturing food. And then on the other side, I think, is the demand side. New Englanders are like most Americans. We eat a heavy meat and grain diet. And so the New England Food Vision, for instance, looked at the land in New England and said, okay, how much of the land could we really convert to growing food to meet our current diets? And it's not possible. We need to shift towards slightly more plant-based and eating more with kind of our local ecosystem. So those are the big challenges because they're really kind of philosophical and cultural that need to change in terms of how we think about land development and how we think about consumption. But I don't think that they're insurmountable.
Yes, that brings me to a question that I was going to ask later, but I kind of want to ask it now. So, I mean, you mentioned a number of issues that Rhode Island's trying to deal with. One of it had to do with, sourcing their own food by, I think you said 2060. And I know earlier you talked about food packaging issues. So in your opinion, what would you say would make the biggest impact in the movement toward a more sustainable food economy? Would you say it would be eating local food packaging so that it doesn't have certain contaminants in it and is less wasteful, using pesticide alternatives, or changing what food is even farmed altogether?
Yes, yes, and yes. I think there's, a mentor of mine she says, food is the problem, but it's also the solution. And I think if we can frame it in the way of saying, the way that we eat, the way that we grow and harvest and produce and dispose of food is contributing to greenhouse gas emissions, is contributing to enormous amounts of waste. We can also change those systems, and they can actually be not only net zero, but they can be net positive and regenerative and even sequestering carbon and methane. So I think there's a lot of opportunities. When I think of the biggest impact, I do think that a more regional economy, a more regional food system is easy to understand. People can get behind it, and it has so many benefits when we think about long-term food security. It's really difficult to shift people's diets, but when you get people to think about connecting more to their local food producers and caring more about their local businesses and their community, I think that is something that we have the power to change. So I would say that I'm really inspired personally by the New England food vision. And I really do think that a more regional food economy is something that we'll see. In the news this week, there's been lots of things in the news, but one of the things is around the Ukraine and Russian conflict and its impact on the food system. So 30% of the world's wheat comes from Russia and Ukraine. So I think we're beginning to realize how completely dependent we are on a lot of consolidated commodity foods. I mean, wheat is just everywhere, right? Mm-hmm. And so we need to be thinking about more regional and resilient food economies. I don't think that's going to be happening at a little state level, but I do think if we think more regionally, New England or the Pacific Northwest, I think that there's some really big impact that can happen there.
Yeah, no, totally. I very much agree. What would you say Relish Rhody is doing to address food issues in EJ communities within the state of Rhode Island?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of ways that we're trying to, and there's been a lot of ideas coming up in more recent conversations that I've had with partners on this topic. I think two in particular come up in our food strategy. So one of the kind of 5 pillars of our food strategy is ensuring that all Rhode Islanders have healthy and sufficient food. Mm-hmm. So food access is one way that we're thinking about it. Not just in terms of emergency food delivery and access in that sense, but also empowering communities to produce their own food and thinking about food sovereignty. So the state in particular has contributed to some investments in urban agriculture. We have an organization called Southside Community Land Trust in Rhode Island that's been operating for 40 years. They're our oldest urban farm, and they help people in the urban core in Rhode Island, Providence, Pawtucket, and Central Falls to grow their own food, to get access to urban lots, gardens, and to really engage with the community on the foods that are culturally appropriate for them. Mm-hmm. In the spring, they're going to be opening up a new food center that's going to be housing food businesses from that community, and really increasing access to healthy, fresh, and local foods, something that these particular areas do not have. And if they do, they often can't afford some of the higher cost grocery stores.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Do you think that does Rhode Island have many community gardens out of curiosity?
It does. Yes. We actually have a really vibrant urban farming community, urban gardening. So Southside Community Land Trust helps with that a lot. We need more, but there is a big focus on that. Our state's land grant institution, University of Rhode Island, has a really wonderful co-op extension program called Master Gardeners. And so it's this really low cost program that educates the general public on just growing their own food. And mm-hmm. they have really high demand. I tried to sign up this year. I couldn't get in. So
yeah,
people interested in growing their own food.
I would be interested too. Would you say that with food waste being an increasing problem in the U.S., as well as sourcing energy being an issue, has Rhode Island's Relish Rhody program explored piloting biogas generation plants from food waste for certain state communities?
Yeah, we do have a few digesters in the state. It's top of my mind right now. One of the challenges that we actually have in Rhode Island is our seafood. So we have a $500 million commercial fisheries sector. We are the ocean state. We have significant fish landings, mostly squid, actually. We're known as the calamari state.
Oh, who'd
if
know?
you're eating calamari over on the West Coast, it's possible that it's Rhode Island landed. And so one of the challenges that we have is actually figuring out how to clean the dirty water from processing of the squid and then, disposing of the solids. And so we are starting to kind of explore, could we expand our capacity for biodigesters to handle some of the wastes in this? There was a law passed recently, a few years ago, requiring that institutions that produce over, I think, a ton of food waste have to compost it. And so that has actually kind of catalyzed a growth in the composting sector. So there's just more businesses that are rising up to kind of support the required composting around institutions and food businesses, which is really exciting. But we're definitely thinking a lot about it. We also have a state goal to reduce, I think 100% renewable by 2030. And so I think there's some really exciting opportunities that we can think about utilizing biodigesters to take our food waste and turn it into energy, particularly because our only landfill in the state is set to be at capacity, I think by 2034, which is not that far away.
Yes. And I do know that, especially in New England, because there's not a lot of land, as I understand it, there tends to be some trading of where do you put the waste on your side of the state line, my side of the state line, you know. And so it is an issue that needs to get figured out. So it will be interesting to see how Rhode Island deals with it, because Rhode Island just doesn't have a lot of land.
It's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wish us luck.
Yeah. Do you anticipate the national food economy evolving, or how do you anticipate it evolving over the next 10 years within the U.S.?
Oh, gosh. I love this question because I really like to think about the future and what's possible. And even with all the challenges that we've all lived in the past few years, I do see a glimmer of hope. And I'm starting to see some shifts that really inspire me. I think in terms of diets, I mentioned earlier, we're seeing younger people, Gen Z, college students and age and younger, starting to eat more plant-based diets. We're starting to see that be more popular. In Rhode Island, we have a plant-based food hall. They claim to be the nation's first plant-based food hall. And it's amazing what they do. You wouldn't know that it's vegan food, but you go in and you get like nachos with cheese. And if I didn't tell you, you would never have known that it was vegan. So I think that there's been a lot of exciting food innovations happening around making plant-based foods taste even better than they already did. So that's an area I think we're really going to be seeing a growth in that sector. I also think that we're already seeing food systems becoming front and center. The UN hosted their annual summit this year. It was themed around food systems last fall, which is just really exciting to see that being kind of front and center, and specifically connecting climate and biodiversity to food and agriculture. New Zealand, I believe, has a carbon trading scheme, and they're trying to utilize that to incentivize farmers to plant more trees. I think over half of the emissions in New Zealand is due to agriculture. I think because they have a lot of grazing, cattle and sheep in particular. So that's kind of inspiring, I think, to see money actually going to farms and thinking about farms as having potential to address some of our climate and biodiversity issues.
Totally. I've actually seen there are agribusiness companies that are finding, wow, we could actually sequester carbon in this way, and monetizing off of sequestering carbon. Farmers that traditionally just made money off of growing X and Y food could actually also make money off of, finding ways to sequester carbon, which creates a new a new industry for themselves. One question I did have for you, following up on what you just said, when you were saying you were excited about plant-based innovations in the next 10 years, what would you say to someone who says, well, what about, for example, let's take almond milk. Almond milk as opposed to cow's milk. Cows obviously produce a huge amount of methane, but the factories that have to exist to produce almond milk and put the almond milk in the cartons obviously generate carbon emissions. How would you respond to that in terms of which is worse?
Well, my answer is probably not one that you want to hear, but it depends, and I think to the everyday food consumer, it's
just so you know, Julie, a lawyer loves the answer.
Oh, you love that. Good. So you know what I mean. It completely depends, right? Animal production, animals are a really important part of sustainable agriculture, thinking about their contributions to healthy soils and biodiversity in our soils and all the nutrients there. But when you look at the way that, by and large, we produce animals in, concentrated feeding operations, and they're kind of decoupled from the ecosystem of the farm, it has a higher amount of emissions. And I would say that's often how we produce almonds as well, right? There's a single product that we grow. It's a farm that just has almonds. And so neither of those systems are biodiverse. I'm certainly not an expert in the emissions between the two, although what I've seen from the World Resources Institute, they have this great chart about protein, so plant protein and animal protein, and it shows the emissions associated with each, specifically the greenhouse gas emissions. And the cattle, the ruminants like cows and beef have a far higher impact than almonds, than any kind of legumes or plant-based protein. But it's nuanced. It depends, right? If you have a system that's more integrated, where you have animals doing more pasture raised, and they're contributing to carbon sequestration by kind of grazing the grass, and then that's sequestering carbon. I think it just depends.
Yeah, it probably depends. And likewise, if the factory generating the almond milk has some sort of carbon sequestration engineering controls on it, that can also be something that helps mitigate the carbon footprint of that factory. So, a lot of it probably does depend. I agree. You're right. It would really come down to the specifics of what you're looking at, which farm, which factory. So I do agree. I know that you mentioned that some other states have already started a food sustainability initiative, but was Relish Rhody specifically in terms of its mission kind of a trailblazing unicorn, or was it more taken out of a template another state already has done and just like plopped into Rhode Island?
Well, I can't say for certain because I wasn't here when it was first created. But I do know that we weren't the first to have a state food plan, which I feel that we're lucky because it's such a collaborative space. We all know that success in Rhode Island means success in Maryland, because we can learn from each other and we're not necessarily competing. So I think there's a lot of really great partners and supports across the country that are kind of working together in kind of a peer support way. Like I said before, we're, I think, one of 18 U.S. states that have an established food plan at the state level. There are several others, I think, that are currently working on their plan. I do know that Michigan and Vermont were some of the first in the country to really have a food strategy. And I can see how some of their thinking around food systems, like I mentioned before, economic, environmental, and social, made it into ours as well. So I do think it's really customized to Rhode Island. My predecessor, who really wrote the plan, really focused in on stakeholder input in Rhode Island. And we're really thinking about the assets that we have in our state, our location in this $3.75 trillion economic corridor between Boston and New York City, thinking about our 400 miles of coastland, our fisheries, and our kind of food innovation ecosystem that's unique here. We have a few universities like Johnson in Wales that's really known for culinary science and arts. So I know that it was really customized for Rhode Island, but in thinking of those kind of broader, food systems change that framework, I do think that I can't imagine that Rhode Island invented that. I do think that that was borrowed from some of the other states in thinking about food systems more holistically.
Yeah. I'm sure it was maybe like it didn't completely recreate the wheel. It took some wheel from maybe Vermont and maybe Michigan and then maybe added to it, it sounds like, to customize it. What countries do you think the United States should be looking to in its efforts to move toward a more sustainable food economy? And I am curious specifically, since I do know that you lived in Italy for several years. I don't know if that impacts your viewpoint, if it's Italy or if it's other countries. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, Italy is a good place to start. I think there's so many inspiring examples, also in the U.S. that I've been following and getting ideas from. In Italy, I think that gets to that kind of cultural piece that I was saying. Food is such an important part of their culture, their identity, and their heritage. A lot of people listening might know about the DOC or the DOCG that they have with wine. They also have that with food products. So, you can't call pistachios from Bronte in Sicily unless they're actually from Sicily, right? And so there's this sense of provenance, and places all over the world have that kind of pride as well. We certainly have that in Rhode Island, like Point Judith oysters, right? But we don't have a mechanism to officially protect certain foods and the terroir, the place that they're coming from. So I think that that's something interesting to think about in the US. I want to say that California has been starting to do that, maybe with some of their olive oils and their wines, and really protecting specific products that are coming from a specific micro region. So that's something that I took away from Italy, is having really continuing to strengthen the culture around food and the identity, because I think that makes it something that you love and you want to protect. But some other examples, so I come from the farm to institution world. And so I'm really inspired by places like France and Japan, where school food is more than just like the 15 minutes that American students get to eat. They actually sit down and they have a proper meal. There might be food education that's part of it. There's etiquette. I think in Japan, the students actually serve each other their lunch. So just like taking space to eat and really, really prioritizing school food. And then another one that I always point to is in Brazil, the fourth largest city in Brazil. It's called Belo Horizonte. It's a city of 2 million people. And 10 years ago, they enacted a policy that made food a right, not a privilege, in legislation. And what that did is things like putting local produce in school meals. And they actually took 2% of their city budget to ensure that everyone was fed. So they had these kind of cafeterias and people get tokens. It doesn't mean that, all food everywhere is free, but it ensures that there's a floor, right? Mm-hmm. There's some sort of floor for people that were experiencing hunger. And they eliminated hunger. So it's possible. It's possible.
Wow, that's incredible. I had no idea. Very cool. What is Relish Roadie's kind of best success story since you've been part of the program at this point?
Yeah, I've been in my position for about a year, and I have been so lucky to just travel around our little state and meet so many of the amazing people growing our food, advocating for local food, not the nonprofit organizations, the farmers, the fishers. It's been really, really inspiring. So I have so many examples. I think one in particular really stands out to me, and that's the success over really the last 15 years of our state's food hub, which is called Farm Fresh Rhode Island. Food hubs are something we're starting to see all across the country that's really filling that gap, the middleman gap, where helping to aggregate local food for the farmers and then kind of shortening the supply chain to consumers. So they started, I think, in 2004, and over the last decade or so, they've grown to being a large food hub that's delivering to kind of really all over New England, particularly in the Massachusetts and Rhode Island area. They now have a 60,000 square foot headquarters, a brand new building with solar on the roof. They have a year-round farmers market. It's beautiful. It's inside. They aggregate local food and distribute it around. They also have these 8 co-locators for food businesses that are beyond the startup stage, and they really need space to kind of grow and manufacture their products. Mm-hmm. And I think they support over a few hundred farmers, fishers, and food makers. So if we, and the state was one of the many contributors to the funding for this project, the Commerce Department, where my role sits. And I think that, certainly Relish Rhody our food strategy can't take credit for that. Absolutely not. But I do think that having a shared vision for the state that stakeholders can believe in and mobilize behind helps leverage funding like private equity, philanthropic, or state dollars, and really helps projects like this succeed. And it's so important to have this type of infrastructure, particularly in the business community. I think if we didn't have places like Farm Fresh Rhode Island, these businesses would leave Rhode Island. They can't find the space to kind of grow and increase their production. So I think that's a really great success story, and they're bursting at the seams. And so I hope we can double what they're doing.
Yeah, it sounds like it's a great, intersection of it's helping businesses and it's also just helping the community at large. So it seems like it's a good success story of like the government and, coming together to help, and then businesses are benefiting as a result. So
absolutely. Yeah. And it is a nonprofit, so I think that allows them to access different kinds of grant funding that they wouldn't otherwise if they were a private company.
Totally. So what would you say is Relish Rhody's next big goal? And that's probably something that's on your plate. So what's your next big goal?
Yeah, I think so. One of the things that I'm really hoping we can do this year is update our state's food strategy. So a lot has happened over the last 5 years. The strategy was really put to the test during the pandemic. The position of the director of food strategy was vacant for a year during the pandemic. So I think right now we're really focused on just kind of recentering the food system as a powerful lever for economic development, health equity, and sustainability. There's a lot of focus right now on 2030 in both the kind of federal space, in the regional space, and within Rhode Island. So my kind of next big goal is to re-engage all the amazing partners and stakeholders and policymakers and leaders that we have in our state towards setting the next version of our food strategy, and really thinking about some of these areas that are front and center right now around climate and social justice issues. So that's what I'm really hoping to lead this year.
Well, it sounds like a big undertaking, but I'm sure that you will be able to be up to the task. So, well, thank you, Julie. And thank you to those of you who are listening on this episode of Sustainable Outlook. We hope you will join us again soon as we continue to explore the intersection of environmental, social, and economic sustainability. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Sustainable Outlook. To listen to past episodes and receive notices for new episodes, subscribe by searching Hub Talks, that's HUB Talks, in your favorite podcast app. We hope you will tune in next time to learn more about the outlook of the burgeoning sustainable economy.